Welcome to another episode of Road to Emporia. One of the big topics, maybe the biggest one that you get asked constantly, kind of the running joke is how do you know you're at a gravel race when everybody's asking you about tires? So we decided to bring on Nat Ross, kind of mountain bike legend. He's working with Pirelli to talk tires, compounds, tread patterns, all sorts of stuff. What tires he would suggest running for Unbound, what size, and a little bit of testing stuff that we got into as well. So welcome Nat Ross to the show, and we're happy to have him. Alrighty, well, thanks for everybody for joining us. We're really lucky today to have Nat Ross join us from Pirelli. I think this is probably the episode that people are going to be the most excited about because you know you're at a gravel race when people start asking you about your tires and tire pressure. So Nat is extremely accomplished cyclist, I think multi-time world champion, Ram winner, Race Across America, and all sorts of different accomplishments. You know, I think the Palmares is a little too long to to list everything out. So I'll kind of turn it over to Nat and let him introduce himself.
Thanks, Travis. Yeah, pretty excited to be joining this group here and looking at what the possibilities are in terms of tire research, tire pressures, performance gains, and obviously the tire talk is, for me, something near and dear, but it was always something as a bike racer that was an advantage, but one of those that you wouldn't really share too many details with your competitors, or you would kind of continually be in that learning process. But I think in this day and age, there's so much information out there, including this podcast now, which will have some tips and some tricks and some very succinct ways of being at the advantageous end as opposed to being handicapped.
Yeah, I think I'm really excited for some of those, and hopefully you can shed some light on them. But we'll be doing some testing and things like that. So kind of take your insight and help that inform the start of our testing.
Yeah, super excited on the testing part. And that's something that's always been near and dear to me, is working with the manufacturers, the engineers, and all the specific product, trying to progress it. So it's amazing this day and age, all the different brands that have that pointy end and have the R&D down, have the in-the-field testing on the front end. The race teams now, again, are doing what they used to do back in the day, which is test the product prior to the consumer having to purchase the product, so that you really have some refined possibilities and choices out there. And with Pirelli, this is my fourth year, going on fifth year with Pirelli, we really look at defining the terrain that you ride in. Generally speaking, but in the race scenarios like we're talking about here, it will be the exact terrain of the race during the race conditions for that weekend, or specific kind of the way that the tire comes in contact with the ground. So we dig down into details with compounding, land-sea ratios, and go very deep with our engineers, the R&D testing in Milan. Pirelli's an Italian brand that is very near and dear to the DNA of racing.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think a pretty deep DNA in car racing as well, right?
Yeah, I think now a lot of the Americans, and at least in North America, we can follow the F1, and a new exciting addition to F1 this year will be Las Vegas. So not only for the U.S. do we have Austin, but we'll have Las Vegas as a new venue, Miami, and then Montreal in Canada. So kind of 4 stops in the specific area for F1. And the tire racing compounding story with F1 is amazing. And it does correlate and carry over into cycling. So in general, I'm known as a mountain biker. That was my background in racing. I did race professionally for almost 15 years on the same team. And that's back when teams were sponsored by auto manufacturers. So I did race for Trek under the Gary Fisher umbrella, specifically under the mountain bike realm, and got to travel all over the world, race different terrains. And then in the beginning for me, the tires were always the the advantage piece, and I was the very first one to get to race a 29-inch wheel bike in a World Cup or win a World Championships, and race Norbas on the 29-inch wheel bike back when it didn't exist and wasn't even legal with the UCI. So tires, tread, compounding, all of that are near and dear to my heart, and specifically something that it makes a difference in cycling. And it's one of the contact patch, and those areas are just as important as the bike and as important as training.
Yeah, exactly. I think I saw some interesting information. You might have had some involvement with Keith Bontrager and the kind of the first development of 29ers. I know you were the first one to win a professional race, right, on a 29er, but kind of in development with the wheel as well.
Yeah, so really the larger hoop size were only for cyclocross and road back then, but the mountain bike side of things were not. Everything was 26-inch wheels. 27.5 didn't exist. In fact, the 650B or 27.5 was a German or European response to the success of the 29-inch wheel. So it was everybody raced mountain bikes on 26-inch wheels, and Gary Fisher and the engineers, and when he was running the factory team that I was racing on at the time, sat down and said, I have this was Gary, some ideas that he wanted to pass by the engineers and get into some testing. So Travis Brown, who was racing for Trek at the time, and myself got to run head-to-head tests on this product prior to being able to race on it. And Keith Bontrager actually made the original hoops for us in Santa Cruz in his garage, fabricated a 29-inch hoop for a mountain bike. And back then there were really kind of, there was one tire manufacturer that even had some sort of semblance on the mountain bike tires that were knobs. So we were racing on slicks.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, no, I think being on the cutting edge of that technology is really exciting, and I think something we try to do here at SILCA quite a bit. But that's this new. Yeah, I call it new. We're probably 4 or 5 years into the gravel boom, I'll call it. Where everybody's kind of. It's a lot like the early mountain bike days, and I know it gets compared to that a lot of kind of the Franken bikes of people chopping up rims and making them wider, and kind of doing some of these kind of crazy things to get through an event like Unbound, and now we've got a lot more professional looking gravel equipment and purpose built equipment. I've got quite the rocket ship sitting behind me, so I think we'll actually unveil that here soon. But kind of take me through a little bit on tire choice. I know that's obviously a huge topic. I actually got to go to Unbound for the first time last year, sat in the booth and got to meet a couple thousand people coming through, but almost every one of them wanted to talk tires and tire pressure. So, we had a calculator set up and all that kind of stuff to help you dial in the pressure. But talk to me a little bit about the most important factors, what you're looking at for a race, like Unbound specifically, and maybe gravel in general as well.
Yeah, and I think for those viewers that are wanting to head to Unbound, the Expo is the best place to kind of get a flavor of what Emporia, Kansas is all about, and especially the Flint Hills. So from the Expo, every day there's group rides led by everything from athletes to Boy Scouts to local community members. The bike shop there, Gravel City Adventures, does a great job with kind of sourcing and whittling down the product that works well in those areas. And similar for Unbound, you've got those years of tradition, but I notice a jersey in the background there, and I think of like Peter Sagan, Travis, of your studio there. This year for Unbound, I got to ride with Peter, because he didn't do the 200, he did the 100. And in my opinion, the 100 miles is plenty of gravel for the majority of folks experiencing gravel, whether you're a professional racer or whether you're someone that wants to challenge yourself, which is what the Unbound spirit's all about, and especially at Lifetime. So the best part about, in my opinion, heading to Unbound for those of the folks that are trying to get it on their calendar this year is experiencing in full the Expo, because the vendors that set up there, they brought the entire armada of weaponry to do your research there for the gravel season or whatever discipline it is, if you want to have those conversations when you're there. But specifically, the Flint Hills offer a lot of challenges for tires. And the other piece that a lot of folks get into, they can do all the testing that they want. They've got their tire choices down. But when you're riding with a larger group, and it's sometimes in the dust or at least on everything from a 2-track to a gravel road to where the road goes off camber or crosses streams, those are the parts that it does pay to do some pre-riding or even pre-riding in groups. And what I especially encourage folks to do is pre-ride on the tire that they chose at speed while they're determining what their tire pressures are. So I think the first thing is trying to pick a tire for the terrain. And specifically at Pirelli, we do that based off of the tread patterns that work well for general gravel riding. So in the past, we've offered 2 kind of tire treads in the beginning when gravel was just growing. This year, we're up to 6 different tread choices, depending on how folks ride, if they're backpacking, because now there's backpacking races, which would be similar to the DKXL, essentially, for some folks. Some folks are going to do it and stop twice at a couple gas stations and carry what they need, and others are going to take the allotted time period allowed to finish their kind of 300-mile DK 300 excursion. So I think choosing a tire for Unbound should be done with the Flint Hills in consideration, and specifically the spring type weather or that early weather where rocks and sharp flinty rocks under precipitation start to get sharper. So keep in mind that it's not just the tread, but it's also the sidewalls and also if there is a lot of early, depending on whether the course runs north or south or which distances you're doing, there's a lot of different obstacles out there and different parts of the course in general that someone should ask or just research what the best tire is out there at, let's say, Little Egypt or an off-camber section or a creek crossing, and then basically looking at the weather. So in general, a lot of folks are always going to try and get away with the lightest tire. And sometimes I call that just I pivot and go on my experience side a little bit more towards the insurance policy, which perhaps maybe a heavier tire or something with a more reinforced casing. And with the case of Pirelli, we actually launched a new tire at Unbound last year, which was an RC, which in RC world and racing and car racing and all that, that's like the top tier of performance or at that racing end. And really the tread pattern has a very filed, narrow, low profile, high speed tread to it with some knobs on the side when you do turn, when you are going at speed, so that you perhaps don't have to take your foot off on the corners, or you can track and drive in the angle and the trajectory that you're trying to go, especially if you're going head to head, shoulder to shoulder. A lot of the gravel races these days are like a Peloton where your legs getting lifted up, your hips getting lifted up with someone's handlebars next to you, and traction is key at those speeds.
Perfect. So I think it sounds kind of like tread pattern is the number one thing to look out for. We're big on rolling resistance here, and I think we had Dylan Johnson on the podcast actually a couple different times now, and we've talked about Unbound being a little bit of a different beast with the sharp flint rocks. So typically we might say we're going to find the fastest possible tire we can run, and we're going to go that way. But with puncturing being such a risk, standing on the side of the road isn't very fast. So puncture protection being big, what's kind of Pirelli's look on that, and how do you look to prevent flats as much as you can?
Yeah, I think this year in particular, and then moving forward with technologies, you're starting to see different TPIs and different ply configurations. So we've actually taken the constraints of the demands that mountain biking gets with the amount of protecting the sidewall to those same extents. So in the moto world, Pirelli even puts a patented technology called a flipper, where you can run really low technology, low pressures in these tires. and still have the performance gain, or at least even like the land-sea ratio effective enough to be able to have traction and not lose speed. So there are, in our R&D world, a lot of discussions, a lot of like trajectories looking towards how to always be fast, because the racers are going to choose a tire with the least amount of tread, the narrowest possible tire for certain courses, which I think in Unbound, in Europe, there's a lot of ET RTO standards for rims, and the manufacturers are starting to take and make a consistent message to the consumer, whether it be something for performance or for aftermarket or racing in general. But as far as a lot of the manufacturers now are going in 5 millimeter increments, and the 40 or the old school 42 version is basically the new approach for where to start with the tire width for Unbound. You did see some people this year racing even with 50s and wider, and especially in the XL category or the 200, extremely important to even look at going with inserts and really defining kind of what your strategy is for plugging quickly on the go, whether it's with a bacon strip, whether it's a Dynaplug or a stand start. All these riders now should have something on their handlebars, in their jersey pocket, at their disposal to be able to hop off the bike, isolate where this puncture may be, and try and fix it without losing too much air quickly, is the main goal. And then a lot of folks these days on the pointy end of the races, or even for insurance policies, are riding with inserts. And that started to change the past 2 years at Unbound. And there's a lot more folks globally coming over racing with inserts, and a lot of the North American riders are starting to use inserts. So inserts comes from the mountain bike side of things again, where being able to run higher speeds with a racing tire or a low profile tread tire. And even like a example, maybe like a specialized Pathfinder for a person wanting to get into a gravel tire at Unbound that did well this year was a 42C Pathfinder, because of that ridge that it had. And even with the rains this year at Unbound, it didn't carry a lot of that clay or mud or characteristics with it. So it got pretty light during the rain and did wick away kind of the peanut butter sticking that can happen to tires.
Yeah, I got a chance to go ride there. I actually had that tire on. So I avoided all the nasty mud by not racing last year, and just did a nice loop before the day or two before. But yeah, I think I'm kind of looking at some other options, obviously with Pirelli, the different tread patterns and things. I think generally when I think of Unbound, I think, especially the 200, I think of really hot, really dry, mid 90s, and dusty and kind of brutal conditions that way. This past year we saw the exact opposite. It was in the 70s. It was pouring down rain, and it was a big mud fest. So how do we, because I'm going to, I guess, make an assumption here that the H or the RC, kind of the hard packed, fastest rolling tires that Pirelli makes is going to be the
correct
go-to in that hot, dusty condition. At what point do you look at changing to, is the M or the S,
correct. Yep.
more mud focused tires? At what point does that start to make sense?
Yeah. So I think honestly, Travis, for let's just consider about 90% of the crowd that has experience in gravel races, they are going to stick with the H. And if there is a variance for the gravel H, or a choice, it may be gravel RC for the performance gain, which has proven itself at Unbound, and which is specifically more durable at racing with lighter weight in general than the RC. So you can have that high performance choice, or folks may go with the insurance policy, which would be our gravel mixed terrain tire, the gravel BIM. And then at that point in time, it's almost, do you run like a mullet setup with one up front, one in the rear? Do you run different pressures? The gravel S, the gravel soft, would be a little bit more for some off camber or longer adventure style racing, such as like the Arkansas High Country Race. Or something that the weather can, a spring or a fall race where the weather can play its toll. In general, and especially if you look at like Gravel City Adventure and their tire sales in Emporia, Kansas, the Gravel H in a 40C is the go-to tire of choice. I think this year the Gravel RC will give everyone a run for its money. There are about 10 to 15% of those folks that do go with the mixed tire because of its predictability, because of its rolling resistance. It does have more tread. It has a lot more puncture protection on the tread, the file tread pattern itself. And specifically, I rode that tire because me being a tire guy, I don't need to be at the front when I'm not racing anymore, but I do want to make sure that I can help people out and that I can finish the event myself. And I did notice even Peter Sagan and Daniel Loss this year, we stopped to help people with flat tires. After an aid station, when they kind of stopped racing, they started the race in the spirit, and then they were there just to ride and understand kind of what it was like in North America in the gravel scene. So they had a blast, and it was neat seeing them help people change tires and asking them if they need help, support, if they wanted nutrition, or just those are the things that are, if you do have the insurance with you, which is either the plugs to plug your tire, perhaps even more sealant in some cases. A tire boot is sometimes recommended because there are catastrophes or crashes, or there's things that can slice tires out on the gravel roads a lot of times from farm machinery or just pieces of metal that can slash the sidewalls. A boot, a tire boot is extremely helpful. And I just use my blueberry containers for my fruit. I just cut the top of a blueberry container off and tuck that into my jersey, and it's rounded and fairly large, and it will do better than a wrapper or anything else under those emergency situations.
Okay. I know you had mentioned we're kind of talking insurance and things here, and inserts get thrown in that. So what do you look for when you choose an insert? Because I think we're seeing more and more of those come on the market now. Some with some high performance. I think
for a lot of folks, not. Yeah, this is that discussion that you almost want to have with your trusted mechanic or your friends that have already kind of done some of that research for you or alongside, because there's about 16 gravel choices of inserts at this day and age. And a lot of times it becomes down to rotational resistance, which in general, since both tires are rotating, that rotating mass, the more weight you have, the harder centrifugal wise it is to push. It requires more watts, more energy. So in general, when you add something that is rotating on the outside of the hoop like that, weight is the number one constraint. And if you do have a tendency to pinch flat, even tubeless pinch flatting is a big deal, then inserts are something to consider. And I think as far as the insert goes for a lot of racers or gravel riders, it would be something that would be adaptive to several different tire widths, perhaps, in the end, where you're not spending $80 for each tire setup that you have, so that you could almost adapt it between multiple tread patterns for your gravel tires, so that wherever you ride gravel, if you want to keep the insert in, it's in there throughout the season and you're just topping off more sealant. However, do keep in mind that with inserts, in my opinion, it almost doubles the amount of sealant needed to fill those voids, to get to those tight spots closer to the tread pattern, because you are running that bead to bead seal just as tight, and you can run lower pressure, which in a lot of instances is faster. And it goes down to that contact patch that a lot of folks initially, when the wheel sizes, what's faster, 27.5, 26, 29. It's the same thing with that contact patch. Once you have lower pressures there, you can be just as effective in gravel and just as fast. But the inserts are predominantly for racing and at that pointy end. They do help with the higher speeds when you hit everything. A perfect example would be potholes that you can't see because someone's in front of you, where typically on your normal ride going that same speed, you would avoid the pothole. Inserts definitely help from any type of air escaping and getting rid of the seal.
Yeah. Okay. I think the sealant is definitely an interesting one. That's something that we've obviously come out with here. Beginning of 2022, somewhere in that time frame. It all kind of runs together, but we're getting that question a lot, and I think kind of learning a little bit on the fly with the inserts that, if they're porous, they're soaking up sealant and stuff too. So you definitely need more sealant to be able to do its job and seal punctures. So
yeah. And I first started messing around with kind of the inserts before they were called inserts in cyclocross, because we would put old Tufo tires inside of our tires so that we could run them off camber, run them at lower pressures, have performance gains back then. So I've always been comfortable putting something inside, getting rid of the tube and putting something inside and helping to fill that void. But it's such an experiment, and it's always subjective to a lot of failure. So it takes a certain kind of personality or a mechanic with a lot of experience or patience to be able to do that. So I always recommend to folks to consult with their bike shop for the local terrain that they're riding, and remind their mechanic what their favorite tire is, and their mechanic would even know what their bike or their platform is. Because if you're on a full suspension gravel bike, you may not even need to consider inserts, and there's certain elements of performance that may not even be worth going down that insert juncture.
Okay. I know we'd kind of jumping around a little bit, but with the mud discussion, I know typically not muddy, but one of the discussions I heard a lot with us working with a few different pros and kind of getting to hear the insights of what's going on at the pointy end of the race last year, was some decisions to drastically reduce the tire size. Some people were doing that for clearance, just to not have mud caking up. And some people were doing that kind of with the thought of, I'm going to cut through the mud and rather than try to roll over the top of it and let it cake onto the tire. So what do you think the best approach is there? Do you stay with a larger tire? Do you drop the size down? What does that look like?
Yeah, and specifically, since we are talking Unbound, there is a different type of soil configuration and everything having to do with clay, and then the composition of even the way that the rocks and grass and everything can stick to, starting with the tread and integrating into the tread, and then working its way out to the sidewalls, and all of a sudden making what was a 40C tire look like a 2.6 mountain bike tire and perform just as bad. So in terms of a lot of the folks that were prepped in advance of that, and I would say if you were looking at Stillwater, Oklahoma, for heading over for that event in the spring, that would be a specific event as well, where you may want to consider I start out with cyclocross tires, because cyclocross tires, if they fit on your hoops and rims, they're specifically made to run in mud. They wick mud, grass, all that stuff that can really bog you down. So they still roll as fast as any tire out there. However, the UCI has the constraint of that 33C size. So they are very subject to a lot more punctures, and you really need to know how to control your bike. But that's kind of, I would start at that extreme. And grab a cyclocross tire, set up front and rear for the early spring gravel races to have as a backup tire with precipitation. And you'll know that going into these races and events just from all the course recons, the folks that are putting the videos out there, and they'll even dive into the tire pressures that they're riding. So with that 33 or a cyclocross tire, or even a 35C, or if you felt comfortable with a 38C, just shooting the gap and staying with that, you are going to want to run a tad bit higher pressure with the narrower tire than you would by roughly starting in 2 PSI increments. I won't talk bar. I think Americans and all of our pumps and what we're used to is standard just PSI.
Yeah. I'll tell you now, I'm at SILCA, obviously should know all about tire pressure. And if you start talking in bar, you're going to lose me. So
there we go. We're on the same page.
Yeah.
But I did mention real quick, Travis, I did want to follow up with saying that the wider tires in the mud and rain can work, but it is a science. So specifically in precipitous courses or muddy and different types of mud that happen to be in the sport of gravel, you certainly may want to start narrower and avoid going wider in the wet scenario. Yeah. And one thing we didn't talk about is that in Unbound, and I know I'm jumping back and forth, but there may be some folks that are interested in Stillwater in that course, because that's an iconic event as well. But I would say that the rocks in Emporia, Kansas, and the soil and the course does sweat. So because of the humidity, there are a lot more elements of punctures than people are used to. Because you were talking about what you would run into when you were out there, and is that the sweating of the terrain on the course does make it more challenging and poses opportunities for more punctures.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We will. I think we'll be out in Stillwater, and so we'll do some riding out there and try to parlay some of the learnings there into Emporia as well. So awesome. I know kind of one other big topic that I'd like to get into is different tire sizes, front and rear. Not something I've done a whole lot in the past, but this is kind of a new foray for me. So when is that something that you would take a look at, and kind of what are the benefits of running different size tires or different width tires?
Yeah. And some people call that like the mullet setup, for example, but basically what it is, it's performance. And it would be the same thing as like running a front tire or a tire that's designated in a certain direction, putting it in the rear and running it backwards. So there are ways to maintain more traction and keep that trajectory where all the energy that you put into the pedal stroke is translated through the tire and propelling you forward. One of those instances may be, and this is contradictory to a way a lot of folks would see it, but would be to put a larger tire on the front and run with a skinnier profile tire on the rear. And I think at Pirelli, we do develop rear specific tires, and that comes from our moto racing technology. And generally in motos, you do have different front size tires versus a rear size is smaller, and the front size in general on motos can translate and correlate over to the bike as well. So on the gravel bike, you are at an advantage sometimes to put a wider tire up front, a narrower tire in the rear, versus like a road bike on a crit course or something like that. You can sometimes feel even a 5 cent, like a increment tire size. You can tell leaning the bike over on a road bike on a crit course, but on a gravel bike, the performance is there, but you really can't tell that the bike's any twitchier or handles any different. And it's not too dangerous to run a wider tire up front, a narrower tire in the back, and change the tread file patterns accordingly, so that that's where the actual advantage comes from, as opposed to running a similar tire tread front and rear. And honestly, like for some folks, if you're a pioneer or whatnot, a lot of the testing goes down with other brands so that you're testing with 2 different tires, 2 different tread patterns and sizes, that's where you can really start to see the advantage of why running with a more aggressive tire up front, like mountain bikers do, in certain situations, or siping. There's even gravel racers, if you're on the Pro Tour and have had a lot of experience racing overseas, and especially in the spring, in the gnarlier conditions, there is some tire siping for gravel tires that goes to take the tread on the side elements of the rear tire and take away some of those knobs, keep them on the front, but perhaps take them off the rear. So you can really dive into these performance gains. And that's why you guys are doing the testing, is to actually share with the consumers and all your followers and your crowd that there are, if you do take the time, it is kind of fun. And there's some neat things that could be made by changing the tire size, altering it, or manipulating it to be an advantage for your pedal stroke. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I think you, kind of hit on the testing side of things. And we've hinted at that a little bit of what the plans are, but I think, I've probably got 20 or 30 different ideas of what we can ultimately test. And it's just going to be a matter of time with, how much we're going to be able to do. But I think we're definitely going to go, kind of show everybody how to find the optimal tire pressure for them. We have a tire pressure calculator that gets you really close. But we tell people all the time, like, that's a good starting point. Really need to go to your course and do the testing and use that as a starting point. So you're not running a gamut of, 20 PSI difference. You can start, if it says 32 PSI, you can start at 28 and run through, 35, and you're probably going to find the fastest pressure somewhere in there. So, we'll do that. We'll definitely test tire width. What the fastest rolling tire is for my setup, and same kind of thing, show you how to do that at home and figure out what the best tire setup is going to be for them. So whole bunch of other stuff, more aero and maybe equipment placement and things like that, but pretty excited for the testing videos that are going to come out here in the next couple months. So
well, I'm excited because I know in general, I kind of have what I think at Unbound. When I go there, and I've been there many, many times for support and to be just part of that lifetime enthusiasm, but I've never really gone through the steps that you guys have. So in general, I'm looking at the data from all the athletes, all the teams, even the Pro Tour riders that race on Pirelli tires, and what the successes have been. But it'll be really neat to see what the data says. We do our tire testing in Sicily. So when I'm in Sicily for Pirelli, we specifically, the tire testing for our Velo division is done in Sicily, and we take it very seriously with the test track, with test 2 specific employees of Pirelli that all they do is test. And that way we can keep all the data under our control and be able to develop in a way that will help advance the sport. So very excited that when you reached out and said, hey, we're doing some testing on the courses and we want to know what is fastest and why. So do I, especially for an event like Unbound, where there's so many people that they want to have a successful day and they want to know if their choice is the best one.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming on and talking tires and helping with the testing. And, I think it's definitely going to be a fun project, and everybody following along. I think it'll be really good to have how you can go do this at home and figure out what your best setup is going to be. So, but thanks again, Nat, for
Travis,
joining us. Did we miss anything else?
No, I'm just looking forward to meeting your team, Emporia, with those activations again this year, just to be able to meet the folks that are listening to this podcast in person and have these tire tech discussions, which are a little bit nerdy, I got to say, but very, very fun to have. And especially when you can take it and do this in your own garage where you don't have to have a mechanic or a bike shop. So if someone listens to this podcast with us, they can go get inspired and have fun and do what we do. Yeah,
absolutely. Looking forward to it. I think we'll see each other in Stillwater at Mid-South, and then definitely in Emporia. So come on by and say hi to Nat and myself, and don't be shy. We're happy to have the nerdy discussion. So
dig it.
Thank you for watching another episode of Road to Emporia. Thanks to Nat for joining us. It was a pleasure speaking with him. Really insightful stuff on tread patterns and pressures. Excited to go do some testing like we talked about and figure out which size is going to be optimal for Emporia. So if you have any questions, comments, tires that you like to use, leave them in the comments, or you can write it into sales@silca.cc. We'll answer as many questions as we can get to, and we'll see you in another episode.